Hi, folks. Didn't mean to keep you in suspense there. This, of course, is Jay Frost, and welcome to the Philanthropy Mastermind series, where we are really taking you on the road this week, and we are now in a beautiful location, which is, of course, at Rod Davis's house here in lovely Liverpool. And actually, it's a nice part of the day. It was horrible earlier, but now you get to see his beautiful garden as well as the man right here himself. If you do not know his work, Rhodri Davies is, of course, behind a number of things. His work, in fact, there's a copy of your book here.
There's a copy of it, yeah. Please do, yeah.
Okay, so I love to do that. So there you can see, of course, his book, What is Philanthropy For? He is the man behind, of course, the Philanthropisms podcast, which I urge you to listen to if you're interested in the history and practice of philanthropy in context. That is his podcast. It's one that really helps to inform all of us, so we aren't just swimming in this sea of trying to figure out fundraising, but instead we know where this stuff comes from in the first place and what it might mean tomorrow. At least that's the way I think about it. But additionally, he's also a scholar associated with Kent and many other things, and he also has a blog. So I've given you the worst introduction, and I know we're going to hear more about it. But before we get into that, of course, I want to welcome you to this party in this very special place, and encourage you to participate through the chat. And I want to just see if anybody's done that yet. And already Heather has. So thank you very much from St. John's, Newfoundland and Labrador. Really great to see you here. Really appreciate that. If you all wouldn't mind joining Heather in the chat and just saying which part of the world you're from, as well as maybe what institution with which you have an affiliation or whatever you'd like to say. And Alice from the Netherlands, I love this, as well as, there we go, for Catherine in Fort Worth. And my eyesight now is on a test because the laptop is across the room. So I will not be reading all your names, but I do appreciate your doing that. We'll also be paying attention, as much as eyesight allows, to all your comments in the chat, as well as in the Q&A. And this is a day when you can ask good questions of somebody who knows so much more than I will ever know about this topic. And even if you weren't here, all I'd have to do is reach out to a library behind me to tell you a lot of things, but we have something much better, which is right here with you. Thank you so much, Rhodri, for being willing to help.
Thanks for having me, Jay, and for coming here. So,
well, it's a pleasure to be here. Thank you for the invitation to your home. Would you mind improving upon the introduction so people have a sense about, the context of
yeah, of course. Yeah, so I mean, I guess I do, as Jay said, a few things. I mean, I wear quite a lot of hats these days, but they're all broadly around the central theme of, philanthropy discussed. So trying to put philanthropy in context, whether that's historical context, which is a big part of a lot of the work I do, trying to sort of understand the wider context of philanthropy today, both, how it works across different geographies and different parts of the world, and also how it fits in with sort of wider debates that are going on in society, and also how it might fit in the context in the future. So trying to sort of think ahead a bit about how things might develop. The sort of the main bulk of what I do these days is under Why Philanthropy Matters, which is the website and the blog, where I do articles and sort of short form bits of content, and the podcast that you mentioned, Philanthropisms, also sits on there now as well. And then the other two main things that I do, I work part-time as an academic at the Centre for Philanthropy at the University of Kent here in the UK. And I also work in-house as the Philanthropy Expert in Residence for a funder, the Pears Foundation, that's based here in the UK as well.
Right. Well, that gives you a kind of inside-outside view, which is rare in our sector, right? I mean, I've always been envious of the ability for people in each part of the sector to communicate with authority, but always frustrated that they didn't seem to communicate with one another, right? Yeah. I'm drawing a pyramid like it's fundraising, but it's the idea that we have scholars here, and then we have practitioners over here, or people and running organizations, and then people raising money, but we don't seem to have conferences where we all sit down together. You're in kind of a unique position because of that work with Pears and others. So how much does that inform your work?
Hugely, and I mean, it's by design, at least. I mean, there's an element of happy accident in it as well. But when I used to work at Charities Aid Foundation, which is a big charity based in the UK, kind of an intermediary that does lots of things from sort of DAFs through to managed foundations and sort of low-level giving accounts. And I worked on the public policy side. So I was very lucky to get a kind of big overview of philanthropy, whether that's corporate philanthropy, high net worth philanthropy, everyday giving. Even then, I was always sort of trying to push to say, let's try and take a step back and still have a think about, beyond the transactional and the products and services we're offering, to what is this stuff all about? Why is this such a constant in human society? Where does it fit in with everything else? Why does it often kind of make people feel so positive, but at other times, attract such criticism as well? What is it about this thing that we call philanthropy? And when I left CAF a couple of years ago, I was very keen to make sure that I kept that broad overview. So I think, as you say, having the ability to work a bit in academia and really kind of dig into things, but not totally going down that rabbit hole. So I'm also still a practitioner of sorts, and so I kind of have to stay relatively grounded. And I also get to see what happens inside the world of a funder as well, even though I should say I'm not the one responsible for making those decisions and giving those grants, but it's fascinating to get a glimpse of what life is like on that side of things as well.
It sounds like the only thing you're not currently doing, and maybe I'm wrong, maybe you are, is actually raising money.
Which is fortunate, because that's the one thing I'm absolutely terrible at. And I've got an enormous amount of respect for fundraisers for precisely that reason. I think the few times in which I've been called upon to try and raise funds for organizations I've been associated with, I've come to realize it's not really my skill set. So, I think people who are able to do that well, and it's a real art and a skill, fundraising, I think, I've got a huge amount of respect for them. So
the only reason I put that forward is because I would think that actually knowing what you know and what you interact with every day and how you think about these things would be very helpful to people who are on that side of the equation, where we're trying to figure out, well, okay, who are the funders who might be the right fit for this project? Because if we just think about them as people who have an interest and have the resources, is that enough?
Yeah, and one of the things I do find is in those occasions where I talk to people who are involved in charities or others that are doing fundraising, that actually it's reassuring to know that the work that I do does have value for them. I think sometimes when you're kind of so thick in the trees yourself, you fall into that trap of thinking, well, this is all obvious, isn't it? Everybody knows this stuff. And I always kind of find by the time I've written something, I get to the end and I think, oh, nobody wants to read this. Everybody already knows this stuff. And you have to put yourself in the position you were when you started and you yourself didn't know it, and the kind of journey that you've been on. And I think when I talk to groups of fundraisers or charities, the thing I always find really rewarding is when I'm reminded that actually, I have spent quite a few years being lucky enough to plow through, all of these books that are around me and speak to people on the podcast and learn an enormous amount. And actually just maintaining that position where I can kind of sit between all of these different worlds and act as a bit of a connector, that in itself has value, I think. So,
and it's a lot of fun.
It's great fun. Yeah, I love it. Because I'm a sort of generalist by nature. I get really interested in things, but then I also get bored quite quickly. So I have to keep it varied and be able to move on and look at sort of new angles and different perspectives.
I'm only laughing because even listening to the last episode, which was an hour and 20 minutes or so, you cover a lot of territory. And in fact, I want to dive into a couple of ideas there, because on the one hand, I do think that they're familiar to us, but not necessarily all the history behind them or all the language that's used. And so one of those things on the historical side that I found fascinating is this idea that, let's say, what foundations do is a direct line to the past historical traditions of, let's say, Europe. But you pointed out that the Waqfs, these are Islamic charitable entities. I guess you could say, you'll define that better, that those have the tradition of giving. Whereas, let's say, the European tradition before that, foundations were set up as vehicles for operating, or what we might think of as grant making and operating foundations, actually coming from two entirely different parts of the world, two different religious traditions. And I find that really interesting. I don't know how much it informs how we think about what we do, but it should open our minds to the fact that what we do is not is not just born in one place, that we come from a complex, set of traditions. Can you talk a little bit about the history of where we find ourselves in terms of philanthropy, wherever you want to start?
Yeah, I mean, absolutely, I can. And yeah, I should say the episode of Philanthropisms you're referencing was a sort of deep dive into the specific history of foundations, and kind of getting beyond the standard story. Certainly, the one that gets told, I think, in the US is everything started at the start of the 20th century with Rockefeller and Carnegie, and that kind of thing. Right. And that is a really important turning point, because things change pretty significantly. But there's this whole history in the UK and continental Europe and other places that goes back a long time before that, where the basic idea of a structure that exists separate from the individual in perpetuity, or at least for a long time, and can kind of take assets and then do things for public benefit with them. That's been around for a long time. And as you say, interestingly, it sort of seems to have arisen in multiple different places across the globe, potentially entirely independently. So there's something kind of inherent in the idea. And actually, that's an interesting example, because one of the things I've been thinking about a lot at the moment, because I'm just pulling together a short course that I'm off later this week to teach at the University of Geneva, is about using historical perspective to inform current practice. So I've been thinking a lot about that question of why is it useful beyond just being interesting. I mean, I think it has value because it's interesting, right? There's moments where you go, "Oh, this is interesting, it's great."
Yeah, nerding out is fun.
Nerding out is fun. But I think also there are a few things. I mean, I think that sense of continuity with the past is really rewarding and enriching. And I think having a sense of, the extent to which we stand on the shoulders of giants is something that I think is quite reassuring for people. I think also I've found in the work that I do, it's really reassuring in the context of some of the more contentious debates that we're having at the moment about philanthropy, because I think it's a challenge often for people in the foundation world or in philanthropy who come to some of these issues about the tension between charity and justice, or whether or not you should have perpetual endowments and this kind of thing, and feel as though they're having to face it on their own for the first time, and as if these things are too difficult to grapple with. Right. And actually kind of unpicking that and realizing that people have been grappling with this stuff for hundreds of years, and it's not that it's not that you're not clever enough to work out these problems. Sure. It's that they're really difficult and perhaps even insoluble, and loads of people have struggled with them for a long time.
Well, you're answering a question I was going to ask, which is why this is important. Because on the one hand, if we look at history, we might say, well, what do we learn from these things? And so then we can apply it. But on the other hand, if it seems like as we peel back the layers of history, we keep encountering the same kinds of questions, what does that really tell us? And if it sounds like part of what you're saying is that, well, what it tells us is that essentially we are not alone, not only in terms of the other people who live with us right now in this work, but also all the people who came before us, wherever they were from. They were trying to figure out what is the role of the individual and the collective in making the world a little better.
Yeah, and I think when you kind of strip it back to that fundamental, that absolutely is it. And you do, I mean, there are things to guard against. You do have to be careful of not assuming that everything from the past relates directly to the present, or can tell you about the future, and there's all kinds of contextual factors. But I do think that idea that, that sort of basic drive for people to act altruistically or to help others, when that becomes something that is sort of institutionalized, or you start to create structures around it, there are a sort of set of themes and challenges that almost automatically emerge. There's things kind of baked into the model in a way. So, criticism of big money philanthropy, right, it's easy to feel because there's been a real upsurge of it in the last 5 or 10 years, as if a lot of these criticisms are new and that somebody's discovered them. And they're not at all. You look back at what people were saying about Carnegie and Rockefeller when they were setting up those foundations, and it's all exactly the same.
So what causes them to come back?
I think, like a lot of things in history, my sense is that they are cyclical, because there's a kind of, maybe it's a generational thing, and each generation has to kind of discover these things for itself, and something brings it to light. And we do tend to, forget these things. I mean, I guess there's a reason that there's lots of versions of that saying that, those who fail to learn the lessons of the past are doomed to repeat them, because there is an element of truth in that. We do tend to go around in these cycles, and what the length of those are depends on what the issue is. But in philanthropy, there certainly feels, when you look at the long history of it, as if there are themes that run cyclically through
it. In fact, you kind of alluded to something that you talked about in that last episode, but I know you've talked about in other episodes too, and it is something that's very topical, but it's also cyclical, and that has to do with I'm trying to remember how the way you referred to it, the dead hand.
Oh yeah,
right, and how that ties to really how much influence the donor has.
Yeah.
So it's not. And first of all, I love phrases that are new for me because I see how they tie to other things we discussed. So I'd love, can you introduce that term, and what it means, but then also how it applies to some of these debates we're having about donor influence, especially dead donor influence.
Yeah. Well, the idea is, and it's definitely, it's not my phrase, so it's not intended to be sort of pejorative, but is this idea, and there's various formulations, but one of them is the idea that, the dead hand of the donor reaches out from the grave to affect, and have an unwarranted influence on the lives of the living. So it's the idea that if you create these structures where a donor's wishes can be cemented or kind of built into something institutional that then lasts forever, those donors, not only because of their power and wealth, exert an influence over the time that they live in, but they can extend that, tens or hundreds of years into the future. And this has become something, over various times over the last sort of at least 300 or 400 years that people have railed against. Often when there are particular examples where the wishes of a donor from a few years back who's no longer around look either sort of anachronistic or out of date or too narrow or actively problematic. So I mean, I talked about some of the examples there in the Victorian era of charitable trusts in Britain that have been set up in the Tudor times, and what they were set up to do was totally pointless now. The money couldn't be spent because you specified.
So there was one you mentioned, which has to do with, I guess, piles of wood.
Oh, piles of wood, for burning heretics.
Right.
So, which was very fashionable in the sort of 16th century. But by the 19th century, it was not really quite so.
So if one set up what would today be considered a grant-making foundation to stockpile wood to burn heretics, obviously that wouldn't work very well in the 21st century. Right.
And there's lots of other examples, and some of them are kind of less funny. So there's a well-known example in the US, and I can't remember where the park is, but it was a small public park, I think, that had been set up by a donor with strong segregationist views and had stipulated that the park was only for the use of white communities, not black communities. And so obviously over time, as the political environment and the legislation changed, that was not only sort of hateful and wrong, it was legally problematic. And so you have this tension between what the donor said they wanted and having to respect that and what society now says.
Wow. So I don't know if this is resonating for any of you, but I am going to tie it back, especially for the fundraisers in our midst, to some of the issues we're discussing, which I know come up a lot with naming. So let's imagine that something has already been named. So now we're not talking about the entity, which has its own complexities and problems, but we're also talking about what happens to us in the receiving end. So let's say we've received funding from an organization or individual. Maybe that happened 10 years ago, but maybe it happened 100 years ago. And it continues to be honored in some way, maybe a way we don't even pay attention to, like if we're walking through the walkways of Yale or Harvard. And I'm only pointing to them because we've heard examples in the recent past from some of our Ivy League institutions that have had to contend with us, not to vilify them. But then they will make this discovery, and slavery is an example of this. The people who had enslaved in the past, that was a source of wealth. They then used that wealth to do things such as fund education. But then later, as our thinking changed, or as people were more mindful of the history of the donations for those halls, those buildings, those rooms, then we started to say, well, do we want those names in our buildings? So that's something that's been happening a lot in England. And I know you take a worldview, but can you help us, especially as fundraisers, think about that in terms of how we have had that discussion historically and how we might want to have that discussion going forward? Because it seems like, if anything, this is accelerated and heightened in terms of the not just the impact, but kind of the severity of the conversation.
Oh, absolutely. And I think it's that severity is probably reflective of the way in which a lot of issues have become increasingly polarized. So I think it's a difficult one to talk about in many ways, in a way that sort of reflects the nuance of it as an issue. I guess the historical perspective on it is that question of whether some sources of wealth are tainted, is one, again, that's been around for a long time. And often that's, well, I think there's two slightly different versions of it. And I'll come back to the one that you mentioned in a moment, which is the sort of historical donor who's not been around for a long time. The other one is the donor who is around at the moment, but for whatever reason, people have questions about the ethics of their business practices or how they made their wealth.
Is there a specific example that
so historically, so I mean, the modern version, obviously, the well-known example would be the Sapplers, but there's other examples. So lots of Russian oligarchs here in the UK whose money was accepted for a long period, and then obviously with the situation in Ukraine was not accepted so much anymore. There are quite a few donors to big university institutions. There was an example at Oxford University a couple of years ago where, interestingly, a man called Max Mosley, who's a very rich man who's involved in sort of Formula One, wanted to give a large gift to a college attached with some naming rights in honor of his son, actually, who tragically had died. But there was a lot of criticism of this because the money had essentially originally come from Oswald Mosley, who was a British fascist politician in the 1930s. And so there was a lot of people kind of said, well,
the sins of the father problem.
Well, it is the sins of the father problem. Yeah, absolutely.
Wow.
I think in that case where there is some sort of living donor, to me, having spoken to lots of charities about exactly this issue, I think often it comes down to quite practical questions about on what basis is this gift being made? What are the demands in terms of whether there are naming rights? Are you evidently giving some sort of reputational benefit to the donor? Are they exerting power over how the money is spent? I think in the case of the Sapplers, I mean, apart from obviously the problems with how they made their wealth and their role in the opioid epidemic, I think a lot of the distaste about their philanthropy was it was so overtly designed to burnish their own reputations, and they put very sort of stringent contractual demands on their gifts about how the money would be used and where it would be spent and the naming rights. So I think it often comes down to those quite practical questions. In the case where you're talking about proceeds from slavery or colonialism or something else that's happened and there's a period of time, it does become more challenging, I think. I know a lot of institutions at the moment are reckoning with their own sources of wealth and naming names that they have on buildings and kind of wings of buildings. I think there the challenge is, I mean, first of all, absolutely to acknowledge that these issues are hugely problematic and that we should be willing to face up to those difficult elements of our history. I think not to fall into the trap of saying, oh, this is historical relativism because that's how we think now, but it's not how they thought then. Plenty of people thought it at the time as well and were willing to point it out. I think the challenge is, what do you do about it? Is it enough to take the name off a building or to remove a statue? Is that actually sort of slightly shirking the problem, and that in some ways you need to contextualize that? I know people have quite strong views either way about that. But I think there's also a question about whether some of that can be a bit kind of empty and glib. If you just sort of say, we've looked into our history, it's hugely problematic, all of our money came from the proceeds of slavery, so we've decided to rename this fund. Lots of people might say that's fine and it's a start, but it's not enough. So then you get into some of those very difficult but really interesting questions about whether that philanthropy then has to have some kind of reparative element and whether it needs to sort of repair in some sense the harm that was done through how the money was made in the first place. And when you're talking about a gap of potentially 300 years, that can be very challenging, but it is important.
And I just want to make sure I'm checking in with folks who are with us. So I know it seems like you're just watching a conversation, but that's because I'm so fascinated with everything that you're saying. But if you have questions about this as they apply to your institution or other institutions, you can keep that anonymous by putting it in the Q&A, of course, so we don't have to name check you. But please feel free to interject at any point if you have an observation or you have a question about this, especially as it pertains to recognition that you either currently or historically have offered to your donors, or perhaps the kinds of policies that you have in place to determine from whom you wish to receive support, and whether or not you wish to offer something along the lines of perpetuity. in your donor recognition policies. And in perpetuity itself, also that definition is changing. It doesn't necessarily mean 500 years anymore. It might mean 20 years in the donor agreement. I have so many questions here, but one question is kind of a simple one. Is this important for organizations to know the history of their past donors? I mean, if I'm a fundraiser somewhere, a chief development officer, should I be able to pull out a list, know who's given in the past, and whether or not they challenge us reputationally? Is that important?
I think it is, but with the caveat that I also recognize that that might be asking a lot of small nonprofits that don't have a lot of resource. I think for larger institutions that do have those resources, and particularly where they know that their history stretches back to the point where it's likely that, you know, they are going to find some things that are problematic, that is something that is both kind of, you know, morally worth doing, but also practically worth doing. Because it's the sort of thing, increasingly, as you say, these are things that the public is now aware of. And if you don't dig into your own history and try and understand it, the chances are somebody else will do that job for you, and that can be a lot.
So that's
more
the risk.
challenging.
The risk isn't so much just that we haven't done the right thing, but it's also reputational risk, because somebody else might characterize it in whatever way they wish, and we might not be prepared to address it.
And I think that's that question of reputational risk. I think it can sound as though that's just saying it's only about self-interest, but in the case where you've got living donors and you're trying to make judgments about whether or not to accept donations from them, I think, you know, there are some cases where it's clear cut. There's a legal reason why you can't accept money from that donor. It's the proceeds of crime, or it's sanctioned, or something like that. There are the examples where it clearly conflicts with your own organization's mission. And again, that's relatively straightforward. The ones where it's difficult, and where I think actually a lot of institutions find themselves, are where there's some reason to feel uneasy about a donor or where their money comes from. It's not clear that it directly kind of conflicts with your mission. And it might be that it's your unease is driven more by your own personal views, or that, you know, the views of people in the organization, or your concerns about what supporters might think, rather than thinking on behalf of the organization. I think that is where, if it's not about direct conflict with the mission, it does really come down to some judgment about, is taking this money, which will bring a genuine and measurable financial gain, worse than taking the reputational risk that someone will turn around, whether that's one of our supporters or a member of the public, and say, I can't believe you took that money, this is all terrible, and that might damage your prospects in future. I think there does have to be some element of that kind of pragmatism in that decision making.
And that presupposes that there is a policy in place institutionally, because the legal framework is there. We just have to be aware of it. As you said, no, don't take money from a drug cartel.
Yes.
But then there's the policies we have in place and observing them. But then that means that we have to do, if we have the resources, to conduct some kind of due diligence, which I know for those in the research world, or the research part of fundraising, the due diligence is an important aspect, especially in higher ed, where we seem to have the people and the resources to pay for it. And we do have a question here. I just want to make sure I take a look at it. Any insight on whether nonprofits should be on X or Twitter after recent hate speech from Elon Musk? Now, this is a little bit different, but it is a matter of, again, kind of reputation. It's not about donors, it's about affiliation. In this case, just implied, because we're using a platform. So what are your thoughts on that?
And I think it's it's a great question in itself, and I'm absolutely fascinated. One I've grappled with myself, so I'll be interested to talk about it. I guess it does link, as you say, because one of the other aspects of that question about where is your money coming from, it's quite right if people sort of say, if you focus solely on that and don't focus on, who are your business vendors, what platforms are you using, you're potentially unfairly targeting one aspect of what an organization does. And so I do think actually there's a wider question around technology in terms of, does just using some of these tools that, in the case of, X or Twitter, increasingly people are concerned about because of who owns it. But in other cases, people are concerned about some of these tools because of what they've been designed to do, and the fact they're known to take advantage of sort of addictive behaviors, or they're problematic in terms of mental health.
Very interesting, right? Exactly.
But, I mean, On the Elon Musk X one, I've been in that sort of slow, painful process as somebody who used to use Twitter quite a lot, of extricating myself from it. I think there was a point where I really struggled with it because I started to have concerns about it ethically, but it was still of use to me. I think as the platform itself has become much less good, it's easier because I don't feel as though I'm losing as much. And actually, I barely use it these days just because it got to a point where I was getting little or no traction on things that in the past I would have found, would have sparked conversations. And so I've just sort of shifted, like a lot of people, towards LinkedIn.
Well, even now, you talked about this as there's a legal aspect and there's a reputational aspect of donors, or in this case, media use, or how we are affiliated with different kinds of things. I guess you could say the same thing about whether we do a tie-in with a corporation, and then the old example was the Big Gulp and things like that, or Kentucky Fried Chicken with women's cancer charities, which seem kind of at odds. But sometimes it's also legal. And so right now, most of us in the U.S. aren't using Telegram. I don't know if we can actually, but the CEO of Telegram is currently under I guess, is it arrest, or is it?
I think he is under arrest somewhere in Europe.
You just can't leave the country. You can't leave France. Right now, while they're determining the responsibility of the CEO and the platform in spreading. I don't know.
For the content that it allows to be spread on it.
Toxic content. So this is really a great question. So please keep those coming. Thank you, Anastasia. And it looks like we have something else in the Q&A, so I just want to tackle this so we can continue. Catherine, you'd asked, do you think that there's merit to the idea of adding historical context? Quote, while there are more people who stood against this practice, the concerns or a consensus of the era was that this was okay. We can't unring the bell. We've decided to use this as a teaching point so that society can learn from the fallacies of the past. And in fact, I just want to highlight, as you answer this, you made reference to this before about the kind of postings of, we've done the hard thinking, and now this is what we've come to. I just went to the Science Museum, which is on Exhibition Row, right there in London. And there's a thing on a big area for the most important engineer of the Industrial Revolution, whose name I'm forgetting right now, but he in his workshop designed the original steam engines. Oh yeah. So you know who I'm talking about. Yeah, sure. But there were a couple plaques, and you had to look, carefully for the signage. They weren't hiding it. They were acknowledging his, the fact that he was an enslaver. But it was not the focus of the exhibit. It was a way of it wasn't exactly a mea culpa. It was kind of a tangential acknowledgement. And I mean no disrespect to the museum, but that came up. So how do you see people addressing these things, to get back to Catherine's point?
I think it's a really fascinating one, and I guess a lot of this kind of goes broader than philanthropy. It's about questions of kind of commemoration and celebration and whether the two are the same. And there's some really interesting work around, some of the issues around statues and what you can do in those contexts. Again, is it better to pull them down, or do you kind of add to the context? And does that work? But I think critics would say sometimes it's done in a way that's slightly disingenuous, because as you say, it's a big statue with a tiny little plaque on it.
Right.
Or even where you do put the effort into it, does everybody always get the nuance of that context, or do they just see the big statue and think, well, that person must be wonderful, so that's all I'm going to take from that? I think there are lots of really interesting examples in the world of sort of galleries and museums now, where I think they genuinely are thinking about how they curate collections, particularly of sort of objects that are ethnographic or those sorts of things that have been taken from other parts of the world, and sort of how they contextualize that fact and sort of acknowledge it. There's some really interesting work going on at the Museum of Liverpool actually at the moment, and Liverpool has its own very problematic history of slavery because it was sort of centre of the transatlantic shipping and therefore the slave trade. So it actually puts quite a lot of thought into this stuff. I guess for philanthropy specifically, what I've seen that I think is interesting is where you have organizations like, for instance, the Rowntree Foundation, so the Joseph Rowntree Foundation, and then other ones like the Joseph Rowntree Charitable Trust, and there's a whole sort of group of these things. In a way, it's surprising. Like Joseph Rowntree is a Quaker and is probably seen as one of the good guys historically. but they have put some really interesting sort of proper historical legwork into trying to understand their own history, and the fact that despite those Quaker origins, they've still profited from the cocoa trade in the West Indies, and they've sort of done a lot of work acknowledging that. And even more interestingly, they unearthed some stuff that I wasn't even aware of at all much more recently, where they pointed out that the Rhodri Company in the 1980s had actually operated in apartheid era South Africa, and in a way where it was kind of not just accidental, it was sort of fairly complicit with the government in order to make sure it could maintain its business there.
Right.
And that they have sort of faced up to that very problematic history themselves in a way that I'm sure is kind of been quite difficult and uncomfortable, but I think it is important to do that kind of thing for organizations that are trying to put themselves out there as philanthropic entities.
I'm just wondering, and this is to play devil's advocate, as we say, that if we're being harsher on charities who, as you mentioned before, might have limited resources to investigate these things, especially if they're historical and not contemporary, if we're being harsher on charities than we are on corporations or maybe even ourselves as consumers. So just to make this a personal example, today I made some tea for myself in the hotel room here in Liverpool, and I pulled out my packet of sugar, and you know who it came from. It was Tate.
Yeah.
It was Tate sugar.
Yeah.
So the Tate Museum, of course, has done this work of acknowledgement, and you can see it in their program where they're really talking about the history and of the family and slavery and the sugar trade. But then we're going to just grab the Tate sugar and pop it in our tea without, at least I did, without thinking twice about what make my tea taste a little bit better. Now, I know that Tate's company today is not the Tate of the past, but it is still the name that I'm pouring into my tea. So are we holding our charities to an almost impossible standard because of the nature of the moral work that we believe that we are doing?
I think there's definitely an element to that, and I think it's always a potential concern in some ways where people make that argument that charities or non-profit entities, because of their charitable mission, therefore have to be kind of above reproach with respect to all different potential moral issues, not just the ones that relate to the specific cause area that they have. So I think they do get judged more harshly. I think that's absolutely true. I guess the flip side of it is, do they also have a much bigger ability to kind of imbue people with a good glow or a reputational benefit?
Right.
So that I guess is why people pick on the philanthropy and the charity, is the sense that if you find out that somebody has made their money in a way that you think is morally reprehensible, continuing to use their business, well, lots of people would probably boycott that business, but it's almost, they're not through trying to make money in sort of a cold hard commercial sense, trying to convince you that they're one of the good guys. Whereas by going out there and sort of putting themselves out in the world as a philanthropist, they are making some claim to being, a good human being or a sort of morally worthwhile human being. And that, I think, is where people spot an element of hypocrisy. And most people, I think, hate hypocrisy. It's one of the things that people really dislike.
Except when we're being hypocritical.
But
that's so interesting. And I guess the more moral or ethical we perceive the organization to be or striving to be, the more we hold it to task when there's a failure or perceived hypocrisy. I want to make sure I tackle this next one. And I'm not going to read names in case any of this ends up becoming more personalized, but I am recognizing you for sharing as part of the conversation. We have one that said, Rhodri, that isn't all philanthropy essentially a tool of capitalism more than really making change? In many countries, donors can pass on wealth to future generations, avoiding taxes, which is another element of what you're talking about, right? Because they are supposedly operating for the general good while they become less and less transparent, such as DAFs in the USA. And we've done lots of sessions on DAFs. You've featured alternative ways of giving philanthropy like the wealth shared model. What can we, fundraisers, and everyone else do to promote such ways of giving, particular participatory, etc.? Or is it futile? Because the philanthropists have the power. And I guess that power word is a big part of that question.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, the starting point is no, it's not futile. I think that's the first thing to say. And it is easy sometimes when you dig into critiques and criticisms of philanthropy to see the kernel of truth in lots of them, and sometimes to get a bit despondent and think, oh, you know, is it all, should I just give up on all of that? And then you remind yourself that actually, you know, it's a very, very wide spectrum and always has been. And there are people who do philanthropy for the wrong reasons or in ways that are largely to preserve the status quo or their own power. But I think there always have been people, and very much are today, who recognize that those challenges and those tensions and are genuinely trying to use their philanthropy in ways that address the sort of structural challenges, not just the symptoms of those problems.
What's a name that comes to mind, or two?
So, I mean, I think examples that I would reach for that kind of thing. So, I mean, Mackenzie Scott, I think, is, you know, the easy one to go for. Not everything she does is perfect, but I think in the way that she's focusing on using unrestricted gifts to, you know, to give to organizations already doing the work and sort of trying to shift power dynamics in that way, I think that's really interesting. I think the experiment that was mentioned there, Well Shared, which is something that took place here in Liverpool, is similar to another probably much better known example, which is Marlene Engelhorn, who's an Austrian heiress who recently had a project where she inherited a large amount of money. She's long been involved in sort of campaigns for tax justice and this kind of thing. So she was very concerned about the idea that she as an individual, just because she was wealthy, would have power over how the money was distributed. So she decided to pull together a group of 50 randomly selected Austrian citizens as a kind of citizens assembly, and then allow them to decide how the money was given. So it's about 28 million euro, I think, something like that. So I think experiments like that are really interesting. That's probably at one end of the spectrum. I think there's an enormous amount that can be done that's much simpler than that in terms of organizations that are giving grants or have the ability to give money, thinking about how they can bring the people and the communities that they're trying to serve or to help into the decision making, not just seeing them as passive recipients. I think all of the different elements of sort of participatory approaches are really interesting. I think if you're on the fundraising side, I mean, you can help promote that. And I think maybe, you know, and it's another contentious thing, but talk about some of the principles around things like, you know, community-centric versus donor-centric fundraising and how some of that stuff plays out. And also, I guess, within fundraising institutions, think about what can be done to centre the voices of the people who might traditionally just have been seen as the recipients.
Right.
And so bring them into the organizations that are doing the work as well.
I know we have another question here, so if you don't mind,
no, of course,
grab it. This is from Anonymous.
Okay.
Very easy to cite your name here. Don't you think that this thinking could lead to every organization having some sort of issue? And let's see what issues you're talking about, because I definitely think that is probably true. I mean, if you go back in any organization's personal history, you'll find, or I guess the institutional history, you'll find something objectionable. How much time really should we be spending on this? These are very good questions. Yeah. Is this a big enough concern among a large segment of donors, or are there other trends that you could give practical advice about? I'm sure there are lots, because if you listen to his podcast or his blog, you'll see just how many. But when it comes to this, could you just talk a little bit more about the importance of this?
I mean, to some extent, I think that's an absolutely valid point. I mean, not every organization needs to feel the responsibility to look in detail at their own history, and it might, for practical reasons, be difficult if there's no sort of archival material. I guess the sort of pragmatic hard-nosed argument is the one we were talking about earlier, which is that it's quite possible if you don't do it, someone else will, and if that's something that is going to concern you, that possibility, then it's worth at least understanding that history yourself. I should say, I think in terms of understanding history, I don't think that there's any sense in which if you find something bad within your own organizational history, that automatically means that you need to say, oh, we lost, but that's the end of it. We need to give up. And I think, yes, you're right. Absolutely. When you look back at pretty much any aspect of history, there are going to be things that are challenging or things that are going to be problematic. And a whole lot of history and historical perspective is about developing more of a kind of respect for nuance and context. And one of the things I think that's valuable about that is it kind of reflects back into the present day as well, in that I've found when I've gone to organizations to talk to them about some of these challenges that they're facing in terms of things like, the ethics of accepting donations or potential tensions between different members of staff about the very kind of idea of philanthropy. It's often useful to talk them through the history, just in the practical sense that I think it allows people sometimes to sort of diffuse the situation a bit and see that actually, it gives a bit of that wider context that allows people then to say, okay, by kind of allowing that there might be more than one side to this, then it's potentially a lot of gray area. I'm not just kind of ceding the point or kind of, giving in to what, quote unquote, is the other side. I think it kind of helps to start overcoming some of that polarized mindset. At least that's, certainly one thing that I've found.
Yes, and again, you have that subtitle for your podcast. You're saying philanthropy in context.
Yeah.
And because of the nature of some of the ways I've asked you these questions, it sounds like I'm asking for judgment. But in fact, you are, among many things, but especially an historian. Mm. And as an historian, are you looking for knowledge or are you looking for judgment?
Oh, absolutely. I mean, it's funny in a way. I think of myself as a kind of accidental or sort of ersatz historian, because it's something that I've fallen into. It's not certainly the academic background that I had. I did philosophy. That was more where I came from, sure. Which helps in many ways. It's a similar set of kind of skills. I personally am only ever looking for knowledge rather than judgment. I think one of the things that annoys me most about me is that I struggle often to make clear-cut judgments about things. I think because I dig into them so much that you start to appreciate there's always another angle to pretty much everything. And the more that you kind of complicate the picture, I think the better it is and the more you learn from it, but the harder it is to say, well, it's either this or that.
Right. In a world of color or gray, whichever analogy you choose, that's I guess that helps to prevent this world of black and white or opposing visions and conflict. So I only raise that because the point in some of these questions wasn't to say this is what we must do as fundraisers, but rather what is possible fundraisers that we may not be doing, and how can we be better informed so then we can make informed decisions, not let other people tell us what's right and wrong, but understand the context of what we do. And this is a perfect way to take you down another rabbit hole, and one I know you spend a lot of time on, and we try to discuss a lot in the series, but often from the very practical perspective. So now we're going to take kind of a departure, almost a philosophical and historical perspective on a very hot topic, and that's AI. So right now, whether it's with our sponsor doing tremendous work in AI, a number of other vendors doing it, or just generally, every time we turn on anything from Netflix to Amazon, we are encountering AI. Every time we walk in a grocery store, they are trying to figure out what we want to buy and then trying to sell it to us. When it comes to this world of philanthropy, I'm sure that history must weigh in on how you perceive the utility of AI for us, as well as what we should be thinking about more carefully. Yeah. But we don't have a history of it. So how can you apply the history of the things that we do know to something that's largely growing at this, super fast rate, but is impacting every part of our lives?
It's a real challenge, but I think there is value in using historical perspective when you're trying to look forward. I think apart from anything else, it sometimes allows you to sort of clarify what are the bits that feel genuine and important, and which is, potentially more to do with the hype cycle and the knowledge around
robots overtaking.
Yeah, but I think, on AI, I just pick two things that I think are interesting and important. One that's sort of quite macro level, and then one I think that's more sort of micro level. I guess what the macro level one is those concerns and the sort of narrative about whether automation at a large scale as a result of AI will fundamentally change the economic model that we have. Will we essentially move to a post-work future where most of the jobs are kind of done by AI in one sense or another, and what will that mean? Is it a dystopia where we all have no purpose, or is it some utopia where we're all free to spend all of our time on science and creative pursuits? I think the interesting thing for philanthropy and civil society there is the question of, well, what role does civil society play in that, and what does it mean for civil society? And that's where I think there are some interesting historical parallels potentially. The one I often think about is here in the UK, when the welfare state was created in 1948 with the National Health Service and other aspects, there was a whole debate about whether this was basically the end of philanthropy. The idea was, well, the government's going to do all of it now. It's going to meet all of the needs from cradle to grave. Good, we don't need philanthropy anymore, and good riddance to it, some people said. And then other people said, well, no, this would be, a disaster. We'd lose something kind of, vital to human society. The reality, of course, is philanthropy didn't disappear, but what it did do was evolve in various different ways, and it started to work out kind of what it looked like for voluntary effort and philanthropy to fit in amongst the gaps of a welfare state, whether it had to play more of a role in sort of challenging welfare provision, and whether that put more emphasis on the sort of campaigning and social change element of charities rather than addressing needs.
Yeah.
So I think there's going to be all kinds of questions there about what philanthropy has to do if AI is going to have that impact. The other one that I think doesn't get picked up enough, but something that I'm really fascinated in, is what impact is AI going to have on the choices that we as individuals make when it comes to giving to charity. You mentioned there, we're aware of this technology through things like YouTube, TikTok, and Netflix. And a lot of that is about increasingly personalized and tailored recommendations, and this sort of world that we've been taken into where all of our desires are, increasingly being served up to us on a plate, or at least that's the goal, so that we stay on the platform or keep using the app. I can't see a world where in a year or a couple of years' time, charitable giving isn't going to become part of that as well, because if you're the person running that platform app, you're not going to want somebody to just leave for a bit to go and do their philanthropy or their charitable giving. So you want to offer them that functionality as well. And I guess there's really interesting questions then about what does it look like to allow AI or some form of algorithmic system to recommend cause areas or organizations to people? Who is it who's writing that algorithm? What's their vision of what a good charity or an important cause is? Is that going to kind of undermine people's autonomy and agency? Will that lead them to want to give less? Will popular nonprofits and sort of popular causes start to do even better? And will that come at the expense of more challenging causes and organizations, because the people just want to feed people things that are comfortable and that it's that they already give to? So I think there are kind of real questions that we need to work through before we start just letting this stuff happen.
And I want to ask you one more question on AI, and it may be, unless other people have questions in the audience, it may be our last question today, but don't go away. I also want to encourage you to join us from London. I'll be leaving Liverpool and going back to London for a couple of great sessions tomorrow and the next day. Really do join us for those. They'll be with leading fundraisers at the English National Opera and other institutions from UNICEF and other places, and you want to be a part of all of that discussion. So please join us. Those will be at 11 a.m. Eastern, and you'll see a link in the chat. And before we go any further, I want to make sure we also put in the chat how people can find out more about your work. Subscribe to the podcast, subscribe to the blog. So could you just share that, and then Jack will put in the chat?
Yeah, of course. I mean, the best place to find most of it is whyphilanthropymatters.com. So you can find all of the sort of articles and content and stuff there, and the podcast back episodes are there as well. There's also a separate website for the podcast, which is Philanthropisms.com, which I've been told many times is an absolutely appalling mouthful. I can just about pronounce it myself these days, so I apologize for that. But
oh, we win on the number of syllables. Philanthropy Mastermind Series, you have nothing to worry about. I also want to make sure that everybody here knows that if you want to know more about not only this episode and share it with your colleagues, and I hope you will, but also all the episodes that have come before. We've done now 592 and growing. You can find all those or many recordings of them at the DonorSearch website. DonorSearch, of course, is our sponsor. We are so grateful to them for everything, including this third year in a row of visiting with friends from the UK. You can learn all about that at donorsearch.net under the resources tab or on the DonorSearch YouTube channel, or you can visit our podcast wherever you like to listen. And finally, there's an email coming to you if you're listening to this, enjoying this live, and all you need to do is click on that link, and you'll be able to get access to this recording. So check all that out. Now, for the ultimate AI question. So the Chronicle of Philanthropy just wrote about this. So I'm not expecting you read the article, but I think you know the story.
What they mean.
All right. So, and maybe it's a different one. I don't know.
Okay,
this is someone who's been, I think Rashida wrote this, and
yes,
she's been in the series. So first of all, Rashida, thank you for all your great work and for writing about this. This is Rashida Childress, wrote about the automated fundraiser, I guess, for lack of a better term. If you don't know what we're talking about here, maybe you can introduce the concept and tell us what you think, especially as it relates to maybe one of the issues we haven't discussed, but I think runs through all of this, which is trust.
Yeah. So yeah, it was a really, really interesting story. I found it particularly interesting because it was something I'd speculated on a few years ago. You know, this kind of thing might happen, that people would create AI agents that could act as fundraisers or philanthropy advisors and either kind of convince people to give to an individual single organization or give them advice on giving to multiple different organizations. And it turns out somebody has now done that. They've created these sort of artificial agents that nonprofits can deploy now to try and do some of the work of fundraisers. I mean, I think there are all kinds of questions about this. There's the very obvious and immediate one of the ethics of ever using, automated systems to replace the work of human beings. I think, there are arguments about where that can be a good thing. I know you've had Alison Fine and Beth Cantor on the podcast before, and I think their work looking at the ways in which this stuff can be deployed sensibly and free up human time to do things that have more value is, I think that's a really good way of looking at it. I guess the bit is, to me, one of those elements of human value in fundraising that is absolutely vital is about relationships and trust building. And if you could use some of these kind of AI agents to do some of the bits of fundraising that nobody really wants to do, very kind of boring, kind of data heavy stuff that's very repetitive, great. I think the suggestion that you might deploy these things, to replace the job of human fundraisers as people who don't just go out there and kind of solicit donations, but act as representatives and envoys for their organization and their cause area, and advocates potentially. I'd be very worried about that. I also think it's too early to know how people will react to this. I've seen at least some research showing that when you tell people that, for instance, an image has been generated using AI for fundraising purposes, they suddenly become quite a lot less likely to give, even if it's essentially the same as a real image that's been not generated in that way. And it might be that we'll all just become so used to it we won't care. But I just think we don't know yet. We don't know what the psychology of this stuff is. So I think we just need to make sure we don't rush too fast into it.
It's an interesting, terrifying, and exciting time. And I'm so glad you could introduce some of it or just share a little bit of it with us. This is just a thumbnail sketch of the kind of content he shares all the time. So I really, really want to encourage you to sign up for that, as well as, of course, the rest of our series. So you'll find those links in the chat once again, and we'll make sure we also put them in the show notes. And until next time, which is tomorrow in London, thanks so much. We really appreciate it. Oh, wait a minute. What is this? Last question. Everton or Liverpool?
Liverpool personally, or the area I live in is quite strongly Everton. So you have to make a choice if you live there.
Have we just alienated our audience? I don't know. I don't know.
Rivalry. It's not one of the bad ones. So.
All right, folks. Fill out that survey, please. And we'll see you all hopefully tomorrow. Till next time. Thank you, Roger.
Thanks very much.